Imagine if you could walk into your grocery store and you only had good choices. All the food that you found there was nature and climate positive. Retailers and food manufacturers have the power to make this vision a reality, and it could be a win-win for farmers, for businesses, and for us as consumers too. Stay tuned to find out more. Welcome to the Circular Economy Show by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where we explore the ins and outs of the circular economy. My name's Joe Isles, and welcome to this very special edition of the Circular Economy Show. We're here at FarmEd in the Cotswolds in the UK to talk about the big food redesign, how a future where nature-positive food that builds biodiversity and tackles climate change could become the norm. To understand what nature-positive food actually is and how we'll get to this future, we're going to be doing some live cooking and speaking with some of the key actors with the power to make this vision a reality. The Foundation's new publication, The Big Food Redesign, focuses on the power of food brands and retailers to make nature-positive food the norm. And it all starts with design. Food design shapes how food looks, how it tastes, and how good it is for us and for the planet. By rethinking which ingredients they use and how they're produced, they can provide choices that are better for customers, for farmers, and for climate and biodiversity too. We're going to look at this big idea from a few different angles today, and my co-host Emma Chow, who's one of the lead authors on the new study, will be in conversation with representatives from FarmEd, Danone, Waitrose, and WWF during the course of the show. But first, we really wanted to bring this topic to life with some cooking of our own. And with me, I've got Chantelle Nicholson, the multi-award-winning chef, formerly of Treadwell's, which was a recipient of the Green Michelin star in 2021, and Allswell, a pandemic pop-up. Chantelle's one of the leading female voices in the UK's hospitality industry, championing seasonality and sustainability. And she's been promoting this through her restaurant and her cookbook, Planted. And she's also an independent board member for Re-London, moving London towards a more circular economy. Chantelle, welcome to the kitchen. You've been sizing up some of these amazing ingredients in front of you. What have you got your eye on today for our lunch?
So I think there's been some really interesting, exciting things, such as the Hodmedod's flour, which is a combination of about 10 different plants all in one. It looks beautiful as well as sounds amazing and delicious. There's some wonderful vegetables. We've got some Hodmedod's beans. We've got some honey, some wonderful pasture-fed beef, and also some wonderful milk as well.
So we'll be hearing a bit more about some of these ingredients, or these types of ingredients, throughout the conversation today, and why they're better for nature, better for biodiversity, and for the climate. But we'll be checking in with you throughout the course of the conversation. Do you know already what you might be cooking for us?
So I think, obviously, we've got all this wonderful food around us, but I'm going to be making a flatbread using some of the wonderful flour, also some spent beer grain flour, adding into the mix for a bit of richness in there. So flatbreads with some beef mince, a bit of freshly made ricotta from the wonderful milk, lots of herbs, and then also a kind of tangy salsa to go with it, and a salad with some YQ grains, some fresh tomatoes, and also some fava beans.
It sounds amazing, and my mouth is watering for the taste test at the end of the show. But first, we're going to head over to speak to our first guest, who's with Emma now. Emma, who have you got with you?
Thanks, Joe. So first up, I am joined by Ian, who is a farmer himself and the founder of this place that we're at called FarmEd. Can you tell us first, where are we? What is FarmEd?
Well, welcome to Oxfordshire, right in the middle of England. And FarmEd is a new centre. I've been working on this project for the last 8 years. And we have developed a demonstration farm, a model farm, showing all the sorts of diversity of cropping, of animals, of habitats, for wildlife, for carbon sequestration. It's effectively a living textbook of the many things that could be done in the future on farms.
Can you get specific? Can you give us some examples, especially for those who maybe have never set foot on a farm? What do you mean? What types of things are you integrating, growing together, that work together?
Sure. So many farms across the world grow monocultures separate from other crops. And you can have vast areas, vast tracts of land growing the same thing. In this country, it's wheat. It may be corn or soy in other parts of the world, for example. But that leads to problems because we have a very intensive practices evolved around monocultures. Yes, we can grow lots of yield, as we know, but actually we lose a lot in the process of doing that. We emit lots of greenhouse gas products, and we also have problems around biodiversity loss. The question then is, if we have more diversity of crops, and I use the word diversity really broadly, including diversity of people within agriculture and food chains. But for me, diversity encompasses everything, including wildlife, including plants that we grow, and as Chantal's explained to us already, you need a range of foods. We don't want to just live on one or two. And in the course of my lifetime, the population's doubled, the human population around the world. And it's doubled on the strength of 4 crops. In this country, it'd be wheat, but rice, corn, soy. Those 4 things have made a massive impact to our population. But there are hundreds of others, and the sort of Hodmedod's example over there of all these wonderful crops that could be grown in the future. We just need more of them. And that's diversity, and that's what we should be doing on farms in the future.
So there's diversity of crops, and what else can help food be nature positive? Joe was using that word a lot, envisioning this future where our food is actively tackling climate change and building biodiversity. What kind of practices or mindset approaches do you need to have on farms?
Well, it's sometimes what you don't do. If you intervene the whole time, if you're creating a sterile environment, then biodiversity won't survive, won't thrive. We'll be effectively controlling it and keeping it out. So we can do that, and we can produce a lot of food doing that. But the challenge for us now, because none of us, my generation, I'm the average age farmer. I'm 58, and for this part of the world, that's normal. We were taught to produce yield, and we've done it really, really well. Unwittingly, in the process of doing that, we've also emitted a lot of problems for the planet, biodiversity loss, and we've warmed the climate. The question is, how do we go back up the track a little bit and go down a different road? How do we get the diversity back into the cropping? And it is mixing things together. In my mind, it's a mixed farming system. So rather than having vast areas of land just doing one thing, which is easy, in a way is easy for us to do from an industrial point of view, but actually from a farmer's point of view, it's not what we've done. For 400 generations, we haven't done it that way. Through the whole of civilization, we've had mixed farming in some form. It's only the last 2 or 3 generations, people like me, that have done it very intensively, and now we're looking at the consequences of it and figuring out how we need to change. We have a big population to feed. We need to produce a lot of food, but we also need to do it in a more sympathetic way. And it's reducing our reliance on the inputs, so in other words, backing off things that we know destroy bird life, for example. If we're using insecticides, or if we're using active ingredients in the environment, and in the UK, 74% of the land is farmed. It's a huge area of land that we have an impact on. Worldwide, it's about 50%, I believe. So what we do on that land is really important, and what we don't do on that land is also important to help re-establish, because biodiversity, if it's still there, can bounce back in big numbers very quickly. On this farm, for example, we started with 44 bird species back in 2014, when we started here. We now have 85. We haven't introduced them. They've come, as you've described, because we've got the diversity of plant species, we've got the diversity of insects, all the things the birds need. We're quite happy to share that.
And you, when you first got this land, 8 years ago approximately, it was conventional, right? So you're very much in the transition. So it makes sense that we're seeing that richness of biodiversity returning to the land as you go on this transition to regenerative food production. And as part of realizing those outcomes that we want, like the soil health, clean air, clean water, carbon dioxide sequestration into the soil to actually be part of the solution to climate change rather than a major contributor, which food is today. What role does livestock have to play?
Sure. Well, it's back to diversity. So we need diversity in all shapes and forms in the food that we're producing, and that will deliver us biodiversity on a much wider scale. I think we need more integration of crops and animals together. In the last 50 to 60 years, the livestock that were intrinsically embedded in a farming system, in a traditional mixed farming system, have all gone west, largely. So all our dairy cows and our livestock, the sheep, have all gone to the west of the country. And in the east, which is drier ground, we're growing crops. So we've separated them out. The question is, where's the fertility going to come from to grow the crops? Historically, for the whole of our civilization, we have integrated livestock with our crops. And we've now separated them, only in the last few decades. I believe we need to reintegrate them. I'm not suggesting we have more, I'm just suggesting we reintegrate them. Because without the livestock in the system, where does our fertility come from for our wheat, for example? We're putting fertilizers on to grow lots of wheat, and that's fine.
Do you want to show the wheat?
I mean,
here's
some wheat that we've just harvested. So these are the grains, the heads of wheat that have been, growing in the field for the last 12 months. And the combine has just gone through.
So this is your standard variety.
This is your standard wheat.
Grown conventionally,
Correct.
Lots of synthetic inputs, lots of tilling.
Yep. So on this farm, we are growing this very conventionally. We pass over it with the tractor 7 or 8 times after we've sown the seed, and we pass over it with fertilizers and fungicides to keep everything clean and growing. And it grows lots of stuff. This is a square meter of the grain that we can produce, and we could bake this and make 3 loaves of bread. Okay, so it's pretty good. Okay. Very, very productive. This, on the other hand, is what you would have found here back before this was invented. This is a product of industrial farming. It's been very successful in terms of yield. But these are the wheats that would have been grown here, ancient wheats. Perhaps the Vikings would have brought them. But you can see, look, there's a difference in yield.
So and a lot different colors too. So genetic diversity, good for resilience.
Huge genetic diversity. So this hasn't had fungicides, it hasn't had fertilizers, it hasn't had weed killers. This one has. Yes, it's yielded more, but this has been done purely by using natural methods. So lots of photosynthesis. We're growing underneath this crop. We also grow a living mulch of clover. So this crop has nothing else in it. So there's nothing else for insects or for birds or for soil life. Under this crop, we have clovers, which we grow with it alongside. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody in the country should go out and do this exactly. My point is, as you've said, genetic diversity is key. We have lots of birds nesting in this crop. We grow alongside nature with this one, whereas with this one, we're excluding it.
Right, working with rather than separate.
Yeah. Sums it up.
And you do have, on the farm, you mentioned the clover, the livestock come and graze that as well, right?
So, as part of our rotation, we have a crop rotation where different crops are moved across the farm. It's like a sort of textbook of all the things that you could do, but that's real farming. So you were talking about water earlier on. So if we integrate and we have diversity across the farm, we enable, by having living cover on the farm nearly all year round, we enable crops to soak up rain when it falls. So instead of it running off the soils into the rivers and flooding everyone or leaching all those nutrients that we're putting fertilizer on downstream, we're actually capturing them in the ground. The livestock that we have on the farm, we have sheep on the farm, we have a micro dairy here on the farm. They're grazing what's left behind. So the clover's underneath this, and we also have pasture in our rotation. So grass. Temporary grass in our rotation, which builds the fertility for this, which is why we don't need the fertilizers. And the longer we go on with this rotation, the more grains we'll get back. The problem we have is that if we step off this treadmill right now and take away its life support system, which is fertilizer, we'll get a relatively low yield. So there's a transition period required. We need to incentivize farmers financially to grow diversity, and we need to recognize they will have some yield penalty in their transition.
Right, so there is that transition period, but you also highlighted through the integration and diversity, maybe your volumes of that go down, but then actually you also have livestock integrated or some kind of intercrop or cover crop that is edible. So suddenly you have a different mix and you're providing a different portfolio of nutrition, perhaps. So moving outside the lens of just a single crop mindset, I think is what I'm getting from the conversation. It seems like this is a no-brainer in terms of outcomes, in terms of soil health long-term, and it's not lower yields forever. There is a transition period, but then actually by taking care of soil health, it can support long-term food output for centuries to come. Thank you so much, Ian, for all the work that you guys are doing. It's amazing and so important, and thank you so much for hosting us. Joe, back over to you. How are things going in the kitchen?
Thanks, Emma. Well, I think they're going pretty well. I've got to say this kitchen environment is alien to me because it's very quiet and there's very minimal mess, which is it's not what I'm used to. But how is it going, Chantal?
It's going really well. I've got this amazing wood-fired oven behind me as well, so I've done some onions in there, so they've got kind of nice sweet caramelised. I'm going to make a kind of pesto with some of the amazing herbs and chilies. I'm going to fry off the beef for the pizza, and so for the flatbreads. I'm working on the salad, so we're all under control.
And you have used some of these heritage wheats that were just being discussed.
Yes, absolutely. I think the Hodmedod's blend is about 6 or 7 different plants as well. So there's some amazing ones in there. Also, I think the whole point of that was that, in terms of biodiversity, that there's even flower petals in the flower as well. So looking further afield than just, I guess what we're used to of that mono crop.
And presumably, as a chef, you're also looking for quality as well, and that comes through in the ingredients?
Quality, absolutely. I mean, flavour is also really key, and I think there's a lot of interesting grains that we're not familiar with that have amazing flavours that I think, we need to become more familiar with as well.
Well, it's all smelling really good. We've been hearing that food brands are really important in this transition. So now we're going to go over and hear from one. Emma is being joined by Marin from Danone.
Hi, Marin.
Hi, Emma.
Thanks so much for joining us. We just heard from Ian about how we can produce food in a way that works with nature rather than against it to allow it to thrive. We started to touch on the role of industry and buyers, and that's something that we found is super important and such a big opportunity in our research for the big food redesign, finding that in the EU and UK, on average, about 40% of the agricultural land is supplying ingredients to top 10 food manufacturers and retailers. So they have huge power, which can be used in a positive way to make these nature-positive, climate-friendly foods the norm in our grocery stores. So we talked about how we can produce food regeneratively and nature-positive. How do we design food? I want to shift gears to how do we design food from a brand perspective, and what's your view on that? Like, how do we apply that mindset?
Well, I think actually how we produce food and how we design food are one and the same, because in the end, what we don't realize is that food is designed. A lot of the food around us is designed, and even though people might not identify as such, there's 160 million food designers out there. And I'm an industrial designer who went into food 15 years ago and then studied circular economy. And if I go back to my industrial design days, I see design as an expression of intent. And so the question that we need to do is, that we need to ask is, how do we shift the intent of what we design? And Ian talked to this just now. How do we shift the intent from designing for yield and designing for nutrients and looking at the world as this big machine in which we are at the center of it and we control everything, towards actually understanding that we are a part of nature and that we need to design in a way that we regenerate the life support systems that we rely on instead of depleting that. When we have that mindset shift, because I think actually designing for regenerative impact starts with a mindset shift, not just with a set of practices. When we have that mindset shift and then we empower those 160 million designers, that's when we can see a very rapid shift of the system. So that is also what makes me hopeful.
And that change of intent, I think, is exactly what we aim to capture in what we're calling circular design for food, which we develop and lay out in the report. And in there that we talk about the first stage, right, is the product concept development. Yep. So what do we bring to market, and embedding in that the intent of designing for nature to thrive. So that all of a sudden, what I'm hearing from you is affirming that completely changes every
Absolutely.
step and decision that comes afterwards. And then we can choose ingredients that are diverse, like all these great ingredients that Chantal has in her box today that are lower impact as part of the transition. I want to get into that more in a second, that are upcycled and regeneratively produced. How is this different, or building upon perhaps, from the work that Danone has already done? They're really a leader, well known in the space in terms of, in the past few years in particular, taking steps to support dairy farmers in particular on their journey to return. How is circular design for food different?
I actually don't think it's different. I think circular design for food is the overarching shift in paradigm in the way we view the world. And to me, if we look at regenerative agriculture, if we look at agroforestry, what they basically are is their design philosophies. Design philosophies that are all anchored in living systems design. And so we're starting to hear all of these new terms and ideas floating around: strip cropping, pasture cropping, etc. In the end, it's kind of like we're moving back to, again, to be in contact with nature and to be a part of nature. It's also, to me, what explains the renewed interest in indigenous food systems. It's because basically these systems have never moved away from nature, and they've never moved to that anthropocentric view where we are in the center and the world is a machine. They've stayed in touch with it. And so for me, the work that we've been doing so far are important puzzle pieces, what we are still figuring out, and in a way that might feel counterintuitive, but in a way actually that is very much part of natural systems as well, because they change through emergence, is what we're still figuring out is how the puzzle fits together. And that's where designing for a circular economy and a circular economy food, in my opinion, is adding an essential part, which is that realization that if circular economy is a shift in terms of the system's mindset and the system's worldview, then we have to next understand that actually that system is designed. And so we have to enable those that design it. And so a lot of the efforts that we've been doing, I think, are simply puzzle pieces, and we're now putting it all together.
So I want to come back first to the lower impact piece, because Alpro is probably a very well-known brand for lots of viewers, and make it clear how that is really, as we see it, a quick win. And so much of the food ingredients options today are conventionally produced. So yes, we can make some swaps when it comes to design decisions to choose alternatives that are also conventionally produced but lower impact. But that's, again, one puzzle piece and step, right, if I'm understanding things, on the journey to putting it all together and designing for system and designing for what Ian was honing in on, like the full farm. So do you have any examples or anything that you can share from a Danone experience perspective to start trialing that and put that into practice?
I could potentially go into both. But first, to look at really the more holistic systemic approach, one of the things that we're experimenting with is learning from chefs and flipping the system a little bit upside down, which is today when we develop food products, basically a product developer, which I used to do for years, goes into a lab, starts to whip up the best possible formula, and then from that formula, we calculate how much product we're roughly going to sell, and we start ordering tonnages of, let's say, a starch. Nature doesn't produce X tons of starch. Nature actually, it could, but it can only do so if indeed you deplete those underlying life support systems, or if you apply a whole load of inputs. When nature thrives is when you actually create an ecosystem, and that ecosystem is in balance. So what we're trying to do now is to say, what if we were to actually develop the farming system while we're developing the food product? And so that the food product itself, or products, it doesn't necessarily have to go into one product, but it could be a range, that they are actually the fruit, if you will, of that entire system. And so that when you start scaling that product, you start scaling a system, which, by the way, would mean that the system isn't going to be the same everywhere. One of the very important things in regenerative development and in circular design is that things are place-based. And so the product that brings a certain set of nutrients right here, doesn't have to be the same product that brings those same nutrients, that brings those same benefits in a different geography, in a different climate, in a different soil.
Thank you, Maren, for sharing all those examples and perspective and insight. I'm going to send it back over to Joe and see how things are going with Chantal.
Things are going well, I think. I think we're about to get quite noisy.
We are about to get a bit sizzly.
What's next? What's the next step?
So all the prep's pretty much done. We're going to fry off this beef mince with a little bit.
And that's the beef mince that was raised on pasture raised.
Regenerative, yes, mob grazed. And we've got some of this wonderful Hodmedod's fava bean. It's kind of like a miso, but obviously made from, I think it's actually a byproduct of what Hodmedod's do in terms of, kind of older fava beans. So great to have a British product that's also...
And bringing in those diverse
exactly,
ingredients.
Something super biodiverse, obviously, in terms of nitrogen fixing as well.
And what about the upcycled ingredients? We spoke a bit earlier about this flour, evergrain flour made from spent brewer's grain, which is part of AB InBev, the big beer and alcohol company. Is that something you're starting to see more commonly available?
I think there's still a way to go with it. I think, in terms of upcycling, obviously in the flatbread mix that I made, from the ricotta, I used the whey that came off that in the flatbreads. So again, just trying to keep things used as much as possible. I think the upcycled food movement, I think there's a bit of a discourse between it actually being produced and the logistics of getting it to food manufacturers, consumers. But I'm hoping that there's more of that comes through.
And presumably that's something that obviously we can talk about at a big scale, which we have been speaking about a bit today, but in terms of thinking of things that would otherwise be thrown out as valuable ingredients, that's something that maybe we could all do even in our kitchens at home. Oh,
absolutely. I think food waste, as we know, is one of the biggest contributors, and I think it has become, to a point that we just need to be a bit more conscious about what we're buying, how we're using it. I think there's great ways of using things up that are about to probably, be at the end of their lives. There's, many things that we can all do.
Well, let's now talk about it on a much bigger scale and ask what it could actually look like on a retail shelf. Back over to Emma, who's with Waitrose and WWF.
Thanks, Joe. That's exactly right. We're in our final round now before lunch, which we're all looking forward to. So I have Ben and David joining us from Waitrose and WWF. And I want to first start with you, David. And as a reminder for everyone, WWF is leading one of the action tracks of the UN Food Systems Summit, all about nature-positive food production. And what is the connection between retailers, because I know you do lots of work, especially in the UK, with retailers and partnering with Tesco's on that. How is that connected? How critical are retailers in scaling up nature-positive production?
Great, Emma, and firstly, wonderful to be here. Thank you very much. As you say, we're in a partnership with one of the UK's major retailers, Tesco's. So this question is one that we've thought deeply about. And I think it boils down to three things, really. Their responsibility, their agency, and their power. So in terms of responsibility, I think it's been best put, really, I've heard it best put by our chair, Dave Lewis, who had the good fortune of working at a very senior level at both Unilever and at Tesco's. And he said to me, when I worked at Unilever, I thought I worked at a food company, but I worked actually in a cosmetics and condiment company. When I came to Tesco's, I realized the difference. When I was at Unilever, in the sustainability argument, he was playing, as he said, at the side of the plate. When he joined Tesco's, he realized that he was responsible for the entire plate. This really brings us onto the agency piece. Retailers are speaking directly to farmers. They are specifying products, particularly fresh produce. So they have this agency with farmers, but they also have this agency with consumers. They design the food environment, where they put things, how they structure their offers. That communication, that conversation that retailers can have with their customers about the entire food paradigm, if you will, is something that's unique to retailers. And then I mentioned power. And in the UK, this is particularly stark. In the UK, you've got 4 retailers basically controlling 70-odd% of the retail market. That gives them immense power if they can coordinate their actions to change things, but also in terms of their advocacy to government to change the rules of the game. So yeah, I mean, retailer, who better positioned really?
Right, and you were mentioning the design of the food environments. You know, most of us are getting our groceries from our favorite retailers every week, especially in urban environments. And they do have the power. They can use this power, teamed with the Danones and other manufacturers of the world, to actually be creating offerings that are better for customers, better for farmers, and better for climate. So how are you seeing then, what are the customer trends? Are customers wanting these better products?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we've seen trends over the last couple of decades it moving in that way. I mean, the last 5 to 10 years, I mean, there's been a real shift in demand for organic is a good example. So Waitrose Dutch Organic would be a really good example of the demand and increase in awareness of more sustainable products. But it's shifting certainly in that direction. There's a long way to go, don't get me wrong. And obviously price and a number of other factors are contributing towards the uptake. But certainly there is a shift towards more sustainable products. What sustainable looks like is a different question altogether. But ultimately, yes, we're seeing a real positive trend towards more conscientious purchasing habits.
So there's lots of work that I know you're doing in the background with farmers, right? Because you're just highlighting the direct relationships. But it does take a new collaborative dynamic between the buyer and the farmer to do what Maren was speaking about, designing for nature with farmers. So do you have any projects that you're really excited about when it comes to working with farmers in new ways?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've had a really strong relationship with our supply base and our farmers in particular, and that's been established over many, many years. There's a number of projects, and it depends on which category you're looking at, and we sell over about 17,000 different product lines, so it's incredibly diverse. But, I mean, we have our own Leckford estate, our farm on our Leckford estate, which we've been using as a test bed, essentially, for looking at regenerative agriculture. As you can imagine, it's an incredibly complex area, but it's something we've been looking at for many years. I guess we were being very rooted in the sort of the regenerative agricultural thinking. You know, bringing that to scale is a whole different story altogether, as we had the conversation earlier on. But we think we've got a sort of a really good grounding to push that agenda forward within our array of products. We've been working with Leaf for many years as a good sort of starting point, I guess, working with our farmers collaboratively to understand and drive them in the right direction, hopefully, towards looking at more regenerative practices. But that'd be looking at soil fertility, water, and conservation, you name it. So it crosses a number of product ranges, but it's certainly given us a really good grounding in moving our thinking forward and working with farmers and other retailers through the likes of yourselves to push this agenda forward, because we can't do it in isolation. We'd be naive to think we can. So working with other retailers, farmers, the whole system has to be the way forward.
And it does strike me, going back to some of the great comments Ian made, of I have hope, hopefully we all have hope, that while we have shifted and transformed the food system, more so for worse, as we've gone to a linear industrial system over the past couple of generations, actually we can rewire and transform our system for a positive direction towards this regenerative future that you're highlighting. So that can give us hope that we can get there, and if we all agree on where we're going and what we need, move very quickly at the pace and scale needed. But it does require that we're in this learner mindset, because we don't have answers. Ian, I love the quote of saying, like, this is a living textbook, right? Because it is a learning journey for everyone, and particularly with farmers. And it requires galvanizing these new types of partnerships. So you're highlighting with Leaf, which is like a farming organization, and there's many other equivalents like that in the world, but what's so important is the context dependency of driving nature positive outcomes, right? Rather than going from the mechanistic approach of saying, here's your prescription of how you grow this crop and what you do to it. Actually, what does this land need? What do I grow here? How do I support these good outcomes? So it does feel like there's some signs of hope when we look across industry, and it's not just those few brave souls who already started moving on this journey, some of them decades ago, towards a regenerative future. But we do have companies like Danone, Nestle, Unilever making commitments, bold statements around and strategies around regenerative production, but it's still not the norm. And we need to get all of industry, not just the 5 or 10 leaders. So what role does policy play in setting new rules of the game to allow everyone to move on this new trajectory?
Yes, it's a good question. I'm actually reflecting on something that Ben said around price. The context of policy is so important for 2 particular reasons. One, policy really sets the incentives. So when we think about what controls, why do we have the system that we have? What is the hard wiring, if you will, that dictates the system that we have? The role of subsidies, hard to overestimate. $700 billion worth of agricultural subsidies worldwide. I think only about $1 billion worth of that is dedicated towards what you would call regenerative or the support of regenerative agriculture. Indeed, quite a lot of that, hundreds of billions of dollars, is driving in exactly the opposite direction. So to reorganise that is essential. And I think we can be quite hopeful in the UK. You know, we have a new agricultural bill. It's just being sort of implemented now, which is switching subsidies from effectively majority production subsidies to majority payment for public goods. So payment for fresh water, so on, a livable landscape. So that, I think, is key. I think there's a lot to be at stake there for the UK in developing that leadership position and how it might be taken up abroad. One big part of that, of course, is what are you incentivizing? How do you understand what the performance of farming is? So, and I'm a really strong believer in this idea of common metrics. You described the rules of the game that policymakers set. Well, if they can be clear about what metrics they want to assess and support on farm, they can harmonise that with the likes of Ben and others who are specifying what they are going to incentivise with their farmers. And that could be truly transformative.
Yeah, but that was something Maren mentioned too about the accessibility, right? If we work with the farmers, if we get things, we're measuring the right outcomes at the farm level, we're designing the right products, then it's about getting it into market and actually making it accessible, making it easy to comprehend when you're standing in front making your choices, and that can set us on that journey to hopefully one day, fairly soon, being able to stand in front of a shelf and know that all of the choices are good choices. So that's really our hope, and thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today and for all the work that you're doing, which is super important. So thank you.
Thank you, Emma.
Yes. All right, so we heard from the farm, we heard from the brands, we heard from the retailers, and now it's a chance to return to the kitchen and see what Chantal has cooked up for us, taking this mindset and these same principles of designing food, in this case the dish, for nature to thrive, which we can also see play out across industry and help us move as quickly as possible to a future where nature-positive food is the norm. So, Joe, how are we doing?
We're doing very well. I'm in heaven over here. I've got the amazing flatbreads. I've had a front row seat watching them puff up in the oven and hearing the great big picture insights floating over the top, Emma. It's been glorious. I think I've peaked.
I'm glad you've been enjoying it. You're like, can we do this every day?
Well, exactly. We're going to have a word. So, Chantal, just remind us what is in the oven right now.
So we have these flatbreads, which are made with some of the herbs from the garden here. We've got the Hobby-Dodds flour, also some of the spent beer grain flour, a little bit of whey to bind that together, a little bit of butter in there. And then on top we have the regeneratively farmed beef mince, which I've cooked off with a bit of the Hobby-Dodds fava bean paste. We've got the fresh ricotta that I made, and then some onions that went into the pizza oven when I got here. So they've gone all kind of sweet and smoky, and we're going to just top that off with a herb salsa with a bit of chili in there for some acidity and kick. And then I've got a very bright looking salad with everything from the garden, including the YQ grains from Hobby-Dodds, the fava beans, herbs, a little bit of vinegar, and obviously a bit more of the fava bean paste for seasoning.
Well, it looks absolutely delicious. Don't let me put you off, because if you burn Emma's lunch, she's
I
going to
know,
be
she'll be
furious.
very upset, isn't she? So, actually, Emma, could you just pass me a plate?
Yeah.
And just while you're dishing that up,
Is that one going to be okay? Just too small?
Yeah.
how can we bring more of this into not just this food, but all the food that we eat? Presumably it gets a lot easier when these products are available for you and for the rest of us.
I think when we have such amazing produce like this, you don't need to do much to it because it is just delicious as it is. I think it's that diversity and, as we've alluded to, we eat kind of about 4 crops are our mainstay. So to be able to bring in these interesting flavors, these interesting ingredients, and make them a bit more mainstream, I think that's how we'll get to in a better place where we need to be.
And it didn't. And presumably, you made a few different decisions after seeing what was on offer, but it wasn't like I saw you arrive a few hours before we started, and you had a quick look at the vegetables and the ingredients. And did it feel like a different process for you as a chef, or is it pretty standard? It's just a new opportunity with new ingredients.
I mean, this is how I would love to work as a chef. That it's reversed. So instead of saying, right, I want X, Y, Z, it's actually saying, this is what's here. How can you use it and make the most of it? Obviously, logistics, supply chain, etc. There's a long way to go with that. But I think to be able to do this is kind of what we'd all like to do.
Certainly. And Emma, you've got your plate ready. Are you dishing up?
Let me just.
I think there's a couple more in there. One in there.
Yeah.
Do I
Cutlery?
tear some
Oh,
off for
here
you?
we go. Yeah,
Emma's
well,
not going
I'm
for
just
cutlery.
going
She's
for it.
going,
she's just going all in.
It's the best part, Joe.
I should probably be wrapping up now, shouldn't I?
Yeah.
Completely gone off the boil.
Food.
Yeah, food was
Food is
Well, wait, that's what we're here
always
for,
number
so-
one. Yeah.
Okay, I can do this. Professional. Okay, so as we try our regeneratively grown food products here today, this amazing flatbread lunch provided to us by Chantal, I just want to thank you from all of us here at Farm Ed in the Cotswolds for tuning in to this episode of the Circular Economy Show. Do visit the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website now to download the Big Food Redesign report that we've been talking about today and catch up on other episodes of the Circular Economy Show. We hope to see you next time. Bon appetit. Good.
I'll get my pedal.